just wanted to say welcome to everybody. We will be holding this sort of hour-long webinar on advancing decarbonization and affordable housing. And if you want to go to the next slide there, Ryan, it'd be helpful. Just give you guys a quick welcome of just sort of who we are and you know why we're here today. And we'll hear a little bit from UNH and John, if you could say a few words, that'd be great too. So I'm with Housing Partnership and our partner Housing Sustainability Advisors, and we're experts in the affordable housing and energy finance space, and we really focus on the intersection of affordable housing, environmental sustainability. We work directly with developers and sort of public agencies to meet a lot of housing and sustainability goals. And the work here today is really made possible by the generous support of the Wells Fargo Foundation. So HP Sustainability, Housing Sustainability Advisors, along with the University of New Hampshire, we've partnered to create a white paper, really in a series of federal policy roundtables, to start to identify what we think the most sort of impactful policy levers are to drive decarbonization in affordable housing. And we're going to launch the full white paper in the fall. And today we're going to go over our higher level sort of outline of that white paper, recommendations, to really get input and to have some discussion and have a panel discussion with some industry experts towards the end, the last half an hour, just to hear about what folks have been doing in their respective industries around decarbonization and affordable housing. John, if you don't mind saying a few words, not to put you on the spot, it'd be great to hear from Wells Fargo, and then Michael from UNH as a welcome to folks.
Great. Hi, I'm John Moon, and I lead sustainability philanthropy for Wells Fargo. And just to make it as brief as possible so we can spend as much time on the material, but for Wells Fargo, climate is an important aspect of our work. Like many of the large banks, we've made some significant climate commitments, including deploying $500 billion in sustainable finance by 2030 and being net zero by 2050. We also have a pretty important focus on equitable or vulnerable communities and an equitable transition. And as part of that, we know that affordable housing and sustainable affordable housing is a very, very important piece of that, both from an emissions and an equity piece. And so that's why we're partnering with the organizations listed above to advance the conversation and ultimately really drive a lot of funding, both public and private funding towards sustainable affordable housing. We know that there's a lot to do, but there's also a lot of resources and, most importantly, a lot of momentum in the space. And so we're looking forward to the conversation and glad to be joining you all today.
Thanks, John. And Michael, it would be great to hear a little bit from UNH.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. And thank you also to John Moon and to the Wells Fargo Foundation again for supporting this and many of the other activities that we're undertaking at the Center for Impact Finance at UNH. I should mention, Esther, also, you know, and many of the others on this call, that we're also running a 7-part series. We just ran the introductory webinar last Thursday, but they're on Thursdays at 2:00 Eastern Time. And if you go to our website, the Center for Impact Finance, you'll see the full series, which people here are invited to if you don't know about, on equitable greenhouse gas reduction. And we're covering a number of the lines of business that you might get involved in. So again, you might want to look that up. And thank you again, Esther, for your work and Housing Sustainability Advisors. And thank you again, John Moon, for Wells' support on all this. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm just going to get into the agenda really quickly so we can get going. So we just did our introductions. We're going to go a little bit into project background and go over our higher level recommendations, really go over today just kind of cross-cutting issues that we found, some cross-cutting solutions, and we're going to pull up recommendations by federal agency. And then we're going to have a small panel discussion. And we're going to have Sadie McEwen with CPC and Stockton Williams with NCSHA and Lauren Enrico with FHFA talk through just sort of their perspective on decarbonization and affordable housing for a discussion there in the end. And that's our agenda for today. And if you guys have questions throughout as we're going through stuff, feel free to put questions into the chat and some folks from our team can field those, or we can get to those questions at the end during the discussion portion. Okay, so again, really quickly, just a project overview. Our goal, just to let folks know, our overall goal with this project was to really come up with recommendations and looking at the highest impact feasible federal policy changes to advance decarbonization and federally supported affordable housing, just to be pretty specific that we are looking at sort of the highest impact. So we don't necessarily go through every single federal agency, but our research really focused in on what we think could be the highest impact to really remove carbon out of the atmosphere and to work specifically on federally supported affordable housing. And we already went over sort of the white paper and when that release is going to be in the fall sometime so that you guys can look at the detailed sort of recommendations and actionable next steps with those. Let's go to methodology really quickly. So our methodology for the white paper, we researched around 150 housing programs and policies, and we really kind of brainstormed and really dove into their impact in both housing and sustainability. So our focus was to see, what could the impact be if we looked at sort of quantifying the baseline for measurement and actionable changes that can happen around potential greenhouse gas emission reductions sort of at the back end, and what were the sort of the widest impact on affordable housing. And we started to get into sort of recommendations around where we think the highest impact could be. And we started sort of ground truthing some of the recommendations that we initially came up with through a series of design labs. And the design labs were with federal agencies and leaders and sort of industry experts in this space. So we had a federal policy roundtable with the USDA, federal policy roundtable with folks from FHFA, with the GSEs, one with Fannie Mae, one with Freddie Mac, one with Treasury, and one with HUD, and asked it sort of pretty pointed questions just to make sure that some of the thinking that we had really matched with where we think, their sort of thoughts were based on where they are today and based on kind of what folks have learned in the industry overall. And then we fine-tuned the recommendations and we sort of took that feedback and we culminated into a white paper. So that was our sort of method that we went through. And just wanted to go over definitions really quickly, just to kind of ground us in what we're kind of talking about today. And we're talking about decarbonizing the multifamily housing sector. And in the white paper that we have that's going to be released in the fall, what we're talking about today is around two things: affordability and decarbonization. So when we talk about affordability, we're using the definition sort of as a baseline, and sometimes affordability is met by subsidy, or sometimes affordability is met by the market, right? So the two areas. So in this case of the white paper, we're mostly talking about subsidized affordable housing, and we're mostly talking about addressing the multifamily housing stock. But we are also talking about sort of naturally occurring, because some of the federal agencies and folks that we are talking to recommendation-wise have way wider sort of portfolios that they meet in affordable housing. And the definition of decarbonization, I know there's not sort of a globally unified sort of definition for decarbonization, but for these purposes, this is sort of how we define it. It's really improvements to buildings that result in the reduction or elimination of carbon dioxide emissions, sort of specifically looking at the building load, looking at high performance envelope. It's not just electrification, and highly efficient all electric equipment is part of that for heating, cooling, and hot water. And then also including renewables and energy storage to really offset some of that that pricing with electricity. And just wanted to talk a little bit about electrification as a piece of the puzzle, because decarbonization, when we start to look at it, it incorporates a lot of the same concepts as energy efficiency, so that it's not sort of mystifying for folks, right? When you reduce your building load, you're really swapping out less efficient equipment for more efficient equipment. And high performance envelope, when we talk about that, that's really including air sealing and it's including insulation. And these are, when we think about decarbonization, they're very pivotal to decarbonization. It's really the hallmark really around energy efficiency to reduce load, to really size your equipment properly. And then we're also talking about water efficiency is also a core component. I think that a lot of folks don't think about and don't necessarily always mention, but reducing water consumption It also helps to reduce the overall emissions of the building. And we've started to really quantify what that actually means and how water and carbon emissions are very directly related. And the key nuance that's important in decarbonization is to prioritize electric over natural gas, because electricity can be offset by renewable energy to achieve decarbonization, and natural gas is inherently a carbon-based fuel. So that's when we talk about decarbonization, what we're really talking about here as kind of the definition. And let's go into sort of why decarbonization. So why decarbonization is because decarbonizing affordable housing, it's very critical to mitigating climate change and really achieving sustainable development goals. And as the global focus on carbon reduction kind of intensifies, it's increasingly important to address the challenges and harness the benefits of decarbonizing this sector in particular, because obviously there are environmental impacts, like we're talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but way above and beyond the environmental impacts is, to tenants and folks that are most vulnerable in the communities have the highest impact in terms of energy costs and highest impact in terms of extreme heat and climate change, as we could see that's sort of happening across the country today in extreme heat weathers. So it's really important to look at improved sort of insulation to regulate temperatures during outages or extreme heat situations, and to look at decarbonization in terms of health and well-being, enhancing indoor air quality when you look at sort of wrapping buildings and putting in a better filtration system and reducing pollution within those buildings and creating more comfortable living conditions, as well as reducing energy costs, is why it's very important and pretty critical to decarbonize, not just to meet climate impact goals. I'll go to the context slide. So just wanted to talk contextually here, just to kind of ground us in where we are today. We're really at a generational moment as far as opportunity to drive decarbonization. We're not just sort of talking about energy efficiency anymore, right? We're talking about carbon emission reductions. There's new funding resources coming in from IRA. There's new administration goals that are bolder than they've ever been. And at the same time that all of these things are happening, there's an urgency when you look at the climate crisis and an urgency when you look at the housing crisis in tandem. And, what we need to look at is sort of all of the pieces that it takes within that ecosystem, kind of above and beyond just sort of funding and kind of financing, but looking at policy levers and looking at federal agencies to really move this market to create long-term sustainable solutions. So, we're sort of at a key opportunity right now in the market, right? Where we can focus on leveraging a lot of what the federal agencies have already done around energy efficiency that's very foundational in their programmatic approaches, to start to bridge and to start to think about what does that look like to bridge to decarbonization to get to where we need to go, right? So we can have an equitable transition around decarbonization and clean energy in this country, and make sure that it's sort of unified and make sure that it's streamlined, and that it's not just sort of about a one-time infusion of cash, but that it's a long-term sustainable solution. And we started to really dig our heels in and roll our sleeves up and say, well, what would that actually look like? And what would the realistic policy levers need to be to make that happen? That's what this white paper is really focused on. Let's go to number 9. I'm sorry, the transforming regulation, the sort of regulatory incentivization environment to meet decarbonization goals. So we're talking about that. We have to do is really update some of these goals to meet these ecosystem kind of transformations, because we already have a very robust housing and energy ecosystem to work off of. So the goal and the policy levers that we focus on are really centering around working off of those ecosystems that are already there, because the foundation already exists, and now it's about really leveraging it to move beyond energy efficiency into decarbonization. And we wanted to make really realistic updates to make the most sort of impactful programs that can actually move forward, and that's really what the white paper is focused on. So let's get into highlighting sustainable housing programs to date. So I think what we want to do is kind of ground us also, not just in the definition of affordable housing and decarbonization, but what we also do in the white paper is we talk about just sort of like just the history of energy efficiency and what federal agencies have been doing and how instrumental federal agencies have actually been. And we've been trying to solve for energy efficiency for quite some time. So how do we start to kind of look at the programs that already exist? And a lot of the agencies that we've talked to, these design labs are thinking outside of the box and where they could start to move in decarbonization. So we just wanted to highlight some sustainable housing programs to date before we kind of get into the recommendations. This is because we didn't focus on every single federal agency. We focused on a few that we think have the highest impact, but we do want to highlight a few of the key sort of energy efficiency programs historically that have really laid the groundwork for us to be able to think through bridging to decarbonization. So the Department of Energy Better Building Challenge has been happening for quite a number of years, promoting energy efficiency in multifamily housing through partnerships with stakeholders. With sort of 20% energy saving goals and campaigns and pledges with a lot of with a large swath of the industry, and really collaboratively working with HUD on this program to get people to start to think about energy efficiency and what does that mean in housing. And HUD's green retrofit program, which is now the green resilient retrofit program that also got an infusion of funds from IRA, provides grant funding and sort of direct funding for retrofits of affordable housing with energy efficiency measures across the board that has been very successful. And also HUD's mark-to-market program has been quite successful in restructuring mortgages in sort of rental agreements to offer opportunities to introduce energy upgrades. And HUD working with FHFA, the sort of FHA component with the GSEs on the Risk Share Plus program, which was very instrumental in facilitating, I would say, a new market around sort of green mortgages in the industry with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And FHA has energy efficient mortgage program for single family that's been quite successful. And the Department of Energy, obviously, the weatherization program has been huge in terms of energy cost savings for low-income families across the country. And the Multifamily Housing Energy Innovation Fund that HUD sort of implemented and administered many, many years ago, but was sort of instrumental in getting, I would say, thought leaders around the table to start to think about how do we solve for this stuff. And HHS also with their low-income home energy assistance program, providing financial assistance for folks around energy needs. So I would say these federal agencies have been quite instrumental in building the platform, and we have a lot more details sort of in the white paper, but just wanted to highlight and give a snapshot to folks that this isn't sort of new, that this is building on what already exists. And now I'm going to let Ryan lead us into cross-cutting issues in decarbonization and sort of what we found. I think it's sort of kind of the business as usual that I think a lot of folks have heard, but just to hear a little bit more higher level around some cross-cutting issues, cross-cutting solutions, and a few more details on recommendations before we get into our panel discussion.
All right, can you hear me? Excellent. Okay, I'm driving the slides too, so I was worried I can't see what the Zoom looks like for everyone. But anyway, so all in all, putting this white paper together for our team has been a pretty iterative process. We did a lot of research and brainstorming between ourselves, presented that to key stakeholders, as Esther mentioned, brought it back to ourselves, talked about challenges and solutions. And across every group of stakeholders that we met with, the same challenges came up over and over and over. And they're listed here on the screen. First and foremost, it's the upfront cost of decarbonization is high. When developing affordable housing, as we know, resources are limited, funding needs are high, and there's kind of this constant push and pull in the scope of work of what can get added, what can get funded. And then throwing decarbonization improvements onto this baseline difficulty in developing and rehabbing affordable housing just throws another big challenge into the mix. For perspective, full decarbonization of a new construction unit can add about $10,000 per unit to the cost of development, and for existing building rehabilitation events, that can run upwards of $25,000 a unit. The split incentive issue also poses a pretty big issue, especially to ROI, and therefore to getting decarbonization done without further regulation or incentives. And of course, in a perfect world, an owner would install energy savings upgrades and be paid back through savings on the utility bill. But when tenants pay for their own utility bills, building owners do not have this important means of repayment, and so the split incentive issue arises. And then adding on top of this that carbon savings measures sometimes have no utility cost savings due to the proportionally higher cost of electricity versus gas, it can kind of further hinder decarbonization efforts. We've also noticed that energy performance and decarbonization approaches are highly disaggregated, and this is something we see everywhere. Largely in subsidized housing programs, the federal government defaults to states, local governments, PHAs to set standards and requirements related to sustainability in that housing. And this is, of course, done through qualified allocation plans, design guidelines, local building codes, et cetera, et cetera. And what we get as a result is that some states are pretty aggressive in taking on decarbonization, whereas others are not for a variety of reasons. And what this gives us is a pretty big disparity in state to state or market to market energy performance in affordable housing. And then we come across often also a lack of knowledge and technical assistance barriers that prevent the uptake of decarbonization. This is another thing that we're seeing at all levels: PHAs, housing agencies, developers, contractors, builders. It's a lack of capacity, in-house expertise, and often also a means to pay for decarbonization. It's just that decarbonization technologies are often not a standard operating procedure right now. And so the uptake of it in the market it's a little slow still. Moving forward, and then let me see if this slide will move forward. Apologies. There we go. So when we're thinking in a general sense about how to decarbonize affordable housing, accounting for the issues that we encounter in the previous slide, we came up with something that looks a little bit like this. We envision a process that is pretty iterative. First and foremost, we need to gradually move affordable housing programs toward decarbonizing by establishing minimum building performance standards for new construction and rehabilitations. And there's a need to implement energy, water, and carbon benchmarking anywhere feasible, especially in the context of the enormous financial opportunity the IRA has given to expand energy efficiency and decarbonization work across the agencies. It's going to be crucial to measure the effect of all this subsidy and monitor where we are in pursuit of our climate goals. And so in order to meet these goals, what we really need is we need to understand where everyone is now, where housing is performing, and then incrementally move the market toward decarbonization. And that first step is going to be getting everyone to a similar starting point and knowing where we're at. So next, we're going to need federal agencies to guide states and other critical constituents on best practices. What we are looking for is something like a national strategy to address broader industry-wide understanding of decarbonization, a proliferation or dissemination of technical assistance, and we need to address the disaggregated nature of affordable housing decarbonization. Additionally, state and local governments could work together to enact kind of high-impact changes that could significantly jumpstart decarbonization through peer-to-peer exchanges that could be facilitated by the federal government or these federal agencies we're talking about. And these peer exchanges might include publishing best practices on QAPs, design guidelines, utility allowances, and then proliferating and then supporting the implementation of those best practices. And then finally, to address the high costs of decarbonization and the absence of that traditional return on investment, the federal government should seek to achieve decarbonization through various different funding sources. And of course, again, the IRA features here. It's provided a great opportunity to incentivize or to require developers to reach deeper levels of decarbonization. And this is crucial because we need to demonstrate to the private market the benefits of decarbonization, that there's an overwhelming lack of data around cost to perform upgrades, the impacts on operational costs, the resulting energy and carbon savings of decarbonization upgrades. And the role of the federal government here is really to fill the gap until the private market gets comfortable or really incorporates decarbonization technology into its standard operating practices. And we see this kind of working similarly to how energy efficiency started out, with the federal government filling the gap. It could come in the form of subsidy, preferential loan terms, grants, other financial benefits. And our vision is really that over time, as we saw with energy efficient technologies, the market will incorporate decarbonization. And then to speak to the cyclical relationship that we envision for this, as the market becomes more capable of bearing some level of decarbonization, we should continue to make minimum performance standards more rigorous over time. Let's see if my slide will change. Okay. So on this slide, we have a snapshot of the agency by agency recommendations that we're making in the white paper. That came from that series of one-on-one and roundtable discussions and refinement and research. And to take one step back, after the first several months of this work, we really picked out these 4 agencies because they have the greatest and broadest geographically potential impact for advancing decarbonization and affordable housing when we focus on them. So in a moment, as I highlight just a couple of these key recommendations, or as you read the slide, you'll notice that in and of themselves, many of these recommendations are rather abstract, or really that is to say that they're not directly implementable. In the white paper, each of these recommendations is accompanied by a series of action steps or discrete implementable actions that serve the recommendations or serve to advance them, really. And when this paper is published in the fall, you can read all the action steps. We neither have the time nor would I be able to keep any of you awake for it if we went and read through each of these action steps. So for now, I'm just going to hit on a few of the key recommendations to give a bit of texture of what we're looking at. And I'll say this at risk of sounding like a broken record. I'm going to repeat that across almost every agency, we've recommended the establishment of minimum building performance standards anywhere that is feasible. This recommendation features in our HUD, USDA, and FHFA sections. It's only excluded from the Treasury section because, as we know, states are responsible for their own QAPs and design guidelines. Although we do recommend publication of best practices for design guidelines and QAPs to advance decarbonization in the LIHTC portfolio. This recommendation to us really is pivotal to transitioning to a climate-aligned future for housing. It is essential for making decarbonization business as usual. So our team's research and experience kind of leads us into the second thing I want to identify here. And that's that utility allowances are a major issue to solve for in advancing decarb and affordable housing, particularly in LIHTC, HUD, and USDA. In the paper, we outline a roadmap for those agencies to modernize utility allowance practices nationwide to utilize the energy consumption model so that utility allowances accurately reflect utility consumption when decarbonization improvements are made to housing. And that has a significant impact on underwriting and therefore gives the opportunity to address those high upfront costs related to decarbonizing. And then finally, throughout the white paper, I would be totally remiss to exclude this, even though I know we're pressed for time. We do talk about leveraging the IRA. The white paper itself is not focused on the IRA, but we would be completely remiss not to mention how it can be leveraged to develop sustainable programs for decarbonizing affordable housing. And Esther, I will kick it back to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Ryan. I know so it's a lot, but I think, you know, when the white paper comes out, and we would gladly also share these slides with folks at the end. We'll PDF this, send it around before the white paper comes out. Now we're going to get to our panel discussion. If you want to get over to that slide, we have today we have with us, we have Sadie McEwen, who's with Community Preservation Corporation. We have Lauren Enrico with Federal Housing Finance Agency, and Stockton Williams with the National Council of State Housing Agencies to just share with us just some insights around decarbonization. And I just first of all wanted, Eric, if you could just say a few words. I know you weren't on before, just from a UNH perspective, because Eric has been really instrumental in working with us on this white paper as well, and we can kind of toggle back and forth in terms of questions for the panelists.
Yeah, thanks. I'm sorry, everybody. I had lightning can strike at weird time. We had a lightning strike at like 3 p.m. like exactly I was logging on. So we only lost power for like a few seconds, but it takes me a long time to get the internet back up and running after something like that happens. So thanks for bearing with me, and I'm glad. And thank you, Michael, for jumping in. And John Moon, I know that Michael thanked you and Wells Fargo for your support, but I have to say it again, we couldn't have done this work without you. And again, to Esther and her team of multifamily mavens. So maybe I would just add just a little bit of broad context. And I know Michael talked about our webinar series that we're having come on, but this just to highlight the opportunity that we'll talk about in that webinar series. Just some real quick highlights. There's an opportunity to reduce multifamily sector emissions by something like 40% by focusing on households that serve low-income households. So massive emissions reduction potential with the potential to save money for both tenants and building owners. Health benefits that from decarbonization that in the state of California alone are valued at something like $3.5 billion a year. Thousands of jobs that can be created. So just I think that if we can crack the nut on some of the non-finance barriers that we're kind of talking about on this panel, to easing uptake, to make it easier for building owners to put these upgrades into place, we can capitalize on that opportunity. So as Esther was saying, there's a whole range of, we're going to focus here on the regulatory challenges. There's a whole range of other challenges, whether it gets to knowledge barriers, like Ryan was mentioning, just competing with for mind share or brain space with affordable housing developers and owners who are grappling with all kinds of other issues at the same time that we're asking them to now add decarbonization to that list of things that they're thinking about. And so we'll be getting into some of that in our webinar series, but it really felt to us, just as background for working with Esther and her team, that reducing regulatory friction and actually even taking advantage of the regulatory environment to find opportunities to push decarbonization was too big an opportunity to overlook, even though we're also looking at how to spend billions of dollars. It's not the only thing that we should be focused on. So that's my 2 cents to add to the panel, I guess.
That's great. Thanks so much, Eric. And yeah, so for each of you, our panelists, if you could just introduce yourselves and your role and kind of what you've been up to in the sustainability space to date in your capacity in your organizations. If Sadie, if you can go first, it'd be great just to hear from you who you are and kind of what you've been up to.
Sure. So I'm Sadie McEwen. I'm the president of the Community Preservation Corporation. CPC is one of the largest CDFIs in the country, focused exclusively on multifamily housing. We're a construction and permanent lender. Most people know us as a New York lender, but we actually have a national footprint. We have the only not-for-profit mortgage bank in the country. We have licenses with Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae, and FHA. And so we are a permanent lender nationally, and we're expanding our construction lending. And what we're up to lately, particularly as it relates to this topic, we have a sustainability initiative that we launched 15 years ago in 2008, and we've been pushing the decarbonization rock up the hill for that amount of time without a sole source dedicated to decarbonization. Lots and lots of sources for affordability. About 50% of what CPC finances is regulated affordable, but we're very excited that finally there's a source in the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund to add to the mortgage process to address decarbonization. And that's broadly our goal, is to try and help put some training wheels on the mortgage markets to help them learn to address carbon routinely in the work that they do. So I will stop there.
Great. Thanks, Sadie. Stockton, be great to do a quick intro.
I'm Stockton Williams, Executive Director of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. We are the Washington, D.C. trade association for state HFAs, which have been mentioned a few times already by some of our speakers. For those who may not know them, housing finance agencies provide about $50 billion a year in financing for single and multifamily affordable housing through an array of programs and financing structures, some of which I'll describe. In addition, though, on the topic of today's call, I think it's also been observed that housing finance agencies are varied in their awareness and their involvement in clean energy and encouraging clean energy and energy efficiency. But in general, the trend is for wider adoption of a number of different policies and programs. And of late, there have been some particularly interesting, more innovative efforts that I also look forward to highlighting. So I'm glad to be here, Esther, and I'll turn it back to you.
Great. And Lauren, it'd be great to hear from you.
Great. Hi, everybody. My name is Lauren Enrico. I am the manager of the Multifamily Policy Group here at FHFA. My office is responsible for all things Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac multifamily. We approve all changes to credit policy, underwriting policy, but we also set the cap for the amount of acquisitions Fannie and Freddie can make in a year in the multifamily space. And within that, we define what is mission driven. A couple of years ago, we added back in green to our mission driven categories in our conservatorship scorecard. And this year, actually, and I'll talk about this a little bit more throughout the panel, we have made it a goal of the agency to have the enterprises, Fannie and Freddie, focus on resiliency and decarbonization specifically in their product offerings.
Great, thanks so much. Well, that does lead right into our questions, Lauren. So perfect. So you do have climate goals. So I guess my first question to you, and then also maybe I'll throw it over to Sadie too. How did you arrive at those goals? And the second question is kind of what are the challenges? So first part, how did you arrive at the goals that you have today? And then sort of what are the challenges in reaching those goals and trying to think through decarbonization in particular, not just energy efficiency?
Yeah, so our director Sandra Thompson, identified just overall climate change as an agency priority. And it is noted as one of our top priorities in our conservatorship scorecard for 2023. As part of that scorecard, we have a specific project that is related to multifamily and asks Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to explore options to expand energy efficiency and improve resiliency through their product offerings. And within that, we have included, as part of that resiliency element, the decarbonization component. One of the reasons that we did this is because we received a lot of feedback from stakeholders about pressing issues in this space, particularly looming decarbonization deadlines. The enterprises have a lot of exposure in markets where decarbonization is required, especially because they largely support affordable housing, much of which is not subsidized actually, but will be facing the need to decarbonize. And I think overall, we believe that that contributes to our larger goals around climate, and trying to address the much larger issues at hand. We also are actively working with other agencies and the White House through interagency policy councils on this topic and on other climate related issues. Specifically, we are working on the building code issue with HUD and USDA right now. And I think that plays very closely into this conversation. In terms of the challenges in reaching these goals, I think, one of our biggest challenges is really market acceptance, and figuring out how to create something that is accepted by the market, especially in a time where we are facing challenging market conditions. And many people feel like there's not room to focus on this one more thing, right? Because we do have rising interest rates and costs and somewhat limited liquidity. So we at FHFA are asking a lot of our regulated entities to, sort of add this into the mix, but we do believe it is a priority. And so that's why we've added it to our goals. And we'll talk about this a little bit further, I think, later in the panel, but the other challenge I think we're facing is just balancing this priority with all the others that the enterprises have. It's extremely challenging. As I said, they are key supporters of affordable housing. And so we want to make sure that all of those priorities are balanced and that, the enterprises are supporting safe, decent, and affordable housing.
Yep, that's great. Thanks so much, Lauren. It's really helpful. Sadie, do you want to build on that a little bit, just how you guys got to your goals? I think addressing a little bit of the market acceptance too, just in the challenges that you have had and how you've had to kind of address some of that around sort of market acceptance and moving forward.
Sure. So very different from FHFA and how they set their goals. Internally at CPC as a lender, initially when we started with our sustainability platform, we just assumed that it would be easy and that it would be accepted. Because when you make your building more energy efficient, you save money. And so that's sort of where we started. But remember, we started in 2008 during a Great Recession. And so there was a lack of tolerance for any additional risk. And so it was perceived that we were suggesting, let's leverage savings from making a building more energy efficient to help add an increment to the mortgage so that there would be proceeds to pay for the efficiency. But there was not really an appetite for taking on that additional risk at the time. So we started with a very deliberate process of trying to institutionalize sustainability across our entire process. So starting from our application, our commitment letter, all of our letters of interest, all of our loan documents, our asset management. So we went through this transformation, and we're trying to get our loan officers to buy in and do it. But it was hard. And so we didn't have goals initially. And so sustainability was only aspirational. It was something we wanted to do, but it wasn't something that my loan officers had to do. And so in 2015, we said, let's add goals. Let's put a number on the board and say they have to achieve a certain percentage of or number of units. And that would, feed into how they performed on an annual basis. And so goals then you became accountable. So from our perspective, if you don't have a goal, it's an aspiration. If you have a goal, you're accountable to getting there. And then it was on us at CPC to support the originator's ability to achieve those goals. And so that's when we really started to focus on working on the policy side to try and get government and, in entities in New York like NYSERDA and the utility companies to refine their tools to support our goals, right? And so then you have to reach out and look around the ecosystem and say, what are all the different tools out there and how can I help them help me to get to my goals? And so we got very involved with government supporting all of the different policies and are now very actively advocating with HCR, we took in the $250 million climate friendly homes fund. Like, we're starting to see more and more resources come to support our goal. And now that there are resources coming, particularly with the IRA, my team is in a place where they know how to do it. They have the technical expertise. We have technical experts on staff that they can call and put on the phone with their customers. So we've built all that infrastructure to support the achieving of the goals that they're now accountable to, instead of sustainability just being something we aspire to.
That's great. I really like that sort of theme of goals and kind of building on that a little bit. Stockton, I want to ask you just, and Sadie, you mentioned sort of HCR. It sounds like, some HFAs are making some really innovative strides at states to sort of advance decarbonization, energy efficiency. If you could sort of provide some best case examples, because it sounds like what it takes is, it's really an ecosystem, right? So it's, you have to have the policy, you have to have the financing, you have to have folks like CPC that are willing to kind of start with the aspiration to then get to the goals to really make a lot of this stuff happen. So Stockton, would love to hear from you just a little more about, HFAs and how they've, and what you're sort of seeing across the country and sort of best case examples that we can maybe potentially ladder up federally.
Yeah, I'd actually like to start with a more baseline level of HFA involvement, because I do think it's important. The housing finance agencies are, a critical part of the affordable housing system, and since they operate on the single family side as well as the multifamily side, I think we shouldn't lose sight of some of the more incremental energy and environmental benefits that are in fact being achieved pretty widely through what the HFAs are doing. So one example that is, I think, of interest to the audience on the single family side, upwards of 20 state HFAs actually run the federal weatherization program in their states. And in a number of states, this has been the case for 10, 15 years, the level of energy savings, carbon reductions, water conservation, are considerable and meaningful. And it's, I think, important, especially because the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is different from the Inflation Reduction Act, obviously, did a 10x increase in weatherization funding. So to the extent low-income, owner-occupied, single-family homes are going to start to go down this road, or more of them are, it's going to be through that vehicle. And we all, I think, understand that single-family homes really have to be part of the equation as well as multifamily. On the multifamily side, though, which I know is mainly the focus this group, the main lever for housing finance agencies that they've used to drive energy efficiency and to some extent clean energy and decarbonization has been through their administration of the federal low-income housing tax credit program, which has been mentioned. And, you know, the overwhelming majority of housing finance agencies have green building requirements or strong incentives. Many also require green CNAs, audits, benchmarking, and the like. And more now are starting to push further in terms of incentives for properties that would achieve passive house standards or even net zero or some type of, you know, deep energy benchmark. A lot of that obviously is happening more on the new construction side. So I say all that to say that the concept of decarbonization and sort of the broader notion of going even beyond 25%, 30% energy efficiency and savings is still quite new for housing finance agencies. I think, frankly, it's new to the affordable housing industry.
Yeah.
Even though the affordable housing industry, as you know well, Esther, has been at the forefront in the multifamily arena more broadly. You know, this area of decarbonization and deep energy retrofits is much more cutting edge. CPC, you know, being an example of a true innovator and leader in the financing area. But there are encouraging pilots, I think, being undertaken, which I know you wanted me to mention. We'll be glad to provide more information in the chat today and in some forthcoming work that we're going to be publishing. But one that really just was announced last week that I think is still getting traction even in the environmental space is the first green bank in the country dedicated entirely to affordable housing in Massachusetts, which, let me check the name so I can say, yeah, the Massachusetts Community Climate Bank, which is actually significantly housed in Mass Housing. It is a part of the State Housing Finance Agency in Massachusetts. It's designed to focus entirely on affordable housing and starts with a $50 million commitment of seed funding from the state. So this is clearly a very interesting first of its kind effort. I'm not going to say today that we'll see lots of other state housing finance agencies create their own internal green banks, but it does certainly represent a leading edge of practice and is very much intended to try to capitalize on some of the Inflation Reduction Act funding. The other innovative program that I think is top of mind for a number of you who are active in New York is the electrification pilot program for affordable housing that is a joint effort between the state of New York's Housing Finance Agency, the local Housing Finance Agency, and the state's main energy office, quasi-public energy entity, that with their three agencies combining their resources is offering substantial incentive for low-income housing tax credit finance properties to do full electrification and get on the road to a complete decarbonization. So these last examples, Esther, are not the mainstream or the common practice. They are the leading edge, but they do certainly suggest where the leading edge is and can be for more housing finance agencies in the years ahead.
Yeah, I love that you're sort of mentioning that, you know, we have our tried and true and X amounts of dollars getting into things like weatherization that are being administered across the country. So we have that base, and that decarbonization is new, right? And that there are folks that are really doing some leading edge stuff like what New York is doing and like what Massachusetts is doing. So those are great examples of how folks are starting to think through new models and ways to infuse housing and energy dollars in a way that works really well for the industry, because we're going to have to go sort of exponentially more beyond, because we can't look at this from a sort of savings perspective, right? Necessarily, right? Because decarbonization doesn't necessarily materialize in that. So how do we start to look at it differently? And you could start to bring in health, you could start to bring in resilience and kind of use these models to move the industry forward. So thanks, Stockton. That's really helpful. So, you know, I think this goes very well with the sort of next question about how you balance competing priorities between housing and climate goals and those sort of like resources, right? So I think, you know, Lauren, in particular for you all at FHFA, you know, it's a constant balance between the two. And I think some of these new innovative models are saying, do we have to balance the two? Can we bring them together? How can we leverage all of this stuff to work together so it's not siloed? Would love to hear a little bit more about that from your perspective, Lauren, or Sadie, if you want to chime in too.
Yeah. So, you know, we always talk about the two pillars that support enterprise financing or enterprise-backed financing, and that's safety and soundness and mission. You can't really have one without the other. So it's important to take that into consideration as we move forward on these initiatives. And I think that you can sort of couch the decarbonization conversation and conversations around energy efficiency and resiliency into that safety and soundness category, right? Because you're looking for durable assets that are going to provide affordable housing in the long term. But simultaneously, the enterprises are charged with supporting affordable housing. And so how do you achieve both? I think in a time of rising costs where margins are extremely tight, producing affordable housing is so challenging. And it might feel like, well, you're just adding fuel to the fire, right? But we are really reliant on our stakeholder partners to help us and the enterprises innovate where possible so that we can combine all of these goals, and making sure that, perfect is not the enemy of the good in this situation, and that we're okay with incremental change. I jokingly say that my mantra is to create policy or make policy that makes everyone moderately unhappy. But I think that the idea behind that is a good one in the sense that, there's a compromise there. And so as we move forward, I think it will take time. I don't think this is something that's going to happen overnight. But from FHFA's standpoint, we have really prioritized this for the enterprises. And I think the enterprises have taken that and run with it. And they really are trying to innovate in this space with our support. And so I think that that's the only way we can do it. And I think that those partnerships from stakeholders like those on the call and the intel that we get from those on the ground is incredibly important in continuing to balance those priorities.
That's great. Thanks, Lauren. And then, I know for purposes of kind of timing, and I wish we had a little bit more time for this because you guys are all doing so many great things. Sadie, would love to hear from you just in terms building on what Lauren just said about the role that the federal agencies can play sort of in achieving decarbonization and bringing in, the opportunity around sort of the IRA right now. And how we can kind of leverage the two would be great to just hear a little bit from maybe everybody on the panel before we have to part.
Yeah, so I'll try to be quick. When I think of federal regulation and how it can create wholesale change, I think about urban centers in the 1970s and the Community Reinvestment Act, and how that regulation caused private investment, not public investment, private investment, to focus on the priority of investing in disinvested communities, and has created massive wholesale change in a lot of those places over the last 4 decades. The other thing I'll say briefly as it relates to priorities is the government has lots of priorities for which they assign resources. And my favorite example of this is housing preservation, historic preservation of buildings, which often become housing. A dedicated source is there to pay not just for the preservation and the historic restoration of the building, but to support the economics of the project as it gets preserved and adaptively reused. So another one is brownfield tax credits, looking broadly at all of the things that support our housing ecosystem and seeing how they can be tweaked or enhanced to include carbon, addressing carbon. I think in addition to private investment coming along is an important thing to do. And I applaud the work that you're doing with UNH, and thank you, Wells Fargo, because highlighting these opportunities at the federal level, I think is really critical.
That's great. I'd love to hear from you, Stockton, a little bit on where do you think the federal agencies can play a role, and just how sort of IRA, kind of a pivotal moment as kind of an ending statement. Would be great to hear a little bit about that from your perspective.
Well, the programs that were authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act are the big opportunity, and probably the last big opportunity for the foreseeable future to do what I think is the most important thing I heard on this panel, which was the reference to $25,000 per unit in additional cost to do a retrofit. That cost has to get paid. Yeah. Unless it's paid, this isn't going to happen at anything like the scale, let alone the speed that is necessary. Mm-hmm. The Inflation Reduction Act has many billions of dollars through grant programs, loan guarantees, and tax incentives as well, which we haven't talked about as much today. A lot of that is going to find its way into the residential sector. the real hope, the opportunity that has to be seized, and I know CPC is absolutely among those trying to seize it, is to get as much into affordable multifamily as possible. The money will have, plenty of challenges in terms of meshing with the rules and regulations in affordable housing, but that's at least a solvable problem if organizations that have the know-how and the commitment to the multifamily sector and decarbonizing multifamily affordable housing will be able to access some of these resources. So the next few months will be really critical.
That's great. Totally agree. I think right now we're sort of a pivotal time where there's a bunch of cash being used in the market, and being able to kind of leverage that as much as possible to create kind of a sustainable system, and where it's working well in the affordable housing industry, which is why we work with Wells and UNH to create a white paper like this to hopefully put something out on the street that people can react to, and of course it's iterative, and we can update it as we need to, maybe do some sort of 2-pagers and takeaways, but I think education is a big part of it. And one of the biggest things here, I know we're talking about policy, we're talking about financing, but I think technical assistance in sort of creating the ecosystem, right, for support to create the market around this is very important too. So I know we are at time, and I didn't know if there was any closing thoughts that anybody wanted to have, or we could leave it at where it's at. Eric, if you want to say a closing remark, that'd be helpful.
Yep, no, just thanks everyone for coming out, and just put this in the chat, but we'll get the slides out to you right away and the white paper forthcoming, and we appreciate your thoughts too, any incoming you have for us as we share out the slides, and things that you'd like to share for us to take into account as we finalize the white paper would be welcome as well. So
Yeah.
thanks so much, Esther and Stockton, Sadie, Lauren, and John Moon as well at Wells Fargo.
Yeah, thank you all for your leadership in this space. You guys are experts, and you are forging a new path forward, and we expect to just continue the conversation. This isn't kind of a one and done thing. I think this is going to be kind of the long haul. We are changing and creating a new kind of market, like Sadie was saying. I think it's a pretty interesting time in history. So thank you guys so much for just taking the time out to speak with us.